Hello and welcome to another episode of Philanthropy in Action. My name is Dennis Surrett. I serve as Executive Vice President and Chief Development Officer here at National Urban League, and it is my pleasure to welcome you to another episode. Today, we have the pleasure of speaking to John Jacob, former President and CEO of the National Urban League. He is a prolific storyteller, strong social worker, incredible leader. He has navigated this organization through some turbulent times going back to the 80s. I think y'all are gonna absolutely enjoy this dialogue and conversation. Enjoy. So I am privileged, honored and privileged to have this time with you today.
So am I. I'm delighted to spend some time with you and to see this new fabulous building that you're putting on God's earth.
We're gonna talk about that.
Sure.
But we're gonna talk a little about you first. So you were the head of two urban leagues in the past, Greater Washington, as well as San Diego. You were executive vice president of the National Urban League, and then its president and CEO. Talk about that journey, if you may.
Well, to really talk about the journey, I've got to go back even further than that. I joined the Urban League in 1965 as the Director of Education and Youth Incentives and Director of a special project called A Future for Jimmy. And the interesting thing about my joining the Urban League is that I was not hired by the then Executive Director. That was the title we used in those days. I was hired by his deputy. But my second day on the job, he knocked on the door and said, "Let's have lunch." He took me across the street to a little restaurant called The Place Where Louis Dwells. It was so dark in there you could hardly see your hand before your face. And his opening statement to me was, "Well, now that you're here, you better go find the money to pay your salary." I started laughing and said, "This is no joke." He said, "We may have enough money to carry you for 3 or 4 months. But if you haven't found the money to pay your salary by then, I'm sorry, but you won't be with us." And I said to myself, I just gave up my big-time supervisor's job at the Baltimore Welfare Department of Public Welfare. I can't go home and tell my wife I was so stupid as to take a job and the man doesn't even have the money to pay me. So I think I better go find the money to pay my salary. And I was fortunate enough working with the then deputy, David Rusk, who was the son of Dean Rusk, who was then Secretary of State. We developed a proposal for the Department of Vocational Rehabilitation based on the fact that we thought we could prove that a child who dropped out of school was just as handicapped as a person with a physical disability. And they gave me $150,000 to prove it. That's how I launched my career in the Urban League. My first week on the job. You got to remember, Ronald Reagan was president then.
I was literally going to ask about Ronald Reagan next.
Ronald Reagan was president, and he literally raped the budget of the National Urban League and local affiliates. At the time that he became president, we had a budget of $29 million in government contracts. They took 17 of those $29 million. Local affiliates had about $100 million. They took 46 of those. So we were really being pressed to run this organization. But the Ford Foundation had been giving the National Urban League $1.5 million every 2 years, like clockwork. It came. So my first week on the job, I called up the president of the Ford Foundation and asked if I could come and see him. And he granted me an interview, so I went over to see him. Now, I had met him because he was a very good friend of Vernon Jordan's. And so we had met. And so I said to him, I said, "Frank, I understand that relationships are not transferable. So I've come to ask you to tell me what you think about the National Urban League. Not what you think about Vernon Jordan, what you think about the National Urban League." He said, "John, I'm glad you came, because if you hadn't come to see me, I was going to call and have you to come over and see me." He said, "Because the Ford Foundation is no longer going to fund the National Urban League during your time the way we did with Vernon Jordan. He said, the way we would deal with you, if you have a proposal that we like, we'll fund it, and if we don't, we won't. And I'm sitting there thinking, my first week on the job, I've just lost $1.5 million. But I immediately said to Frank, I said, I'll tell you what, Frank, give me $5 million, and I promise you I'll never come back and ask you for anything. He said, let me think about that.
Okay.
So he called back a little time later. He said, we won't give you $5 million, but we will give you $4.5 million. And he arranged for me to meet the president of MacArthur Foundation.
Yeah.
And so I jumped on a plane, I flew to Chicago, and I sat with the head of the MacArthur Foundation. And I made my case as to why they ought to give up some money. So he gave us $1 million. So now I got $5.5 million. So I just decided to start making rounds, asking for $1 million at a clip. I finally concluded that it takes no more energy to ask for $1 million than it takes to ask for $100,000. One thing that I tried to do when I was president of the Urban League, though, is not to position us as a not-for-profit, but as a not-for-profit business. And I tried to cast us in the role of not quote-unquote as social workers, but as society's consultants. We had information, we had data, we had knowledge, we had research to back up positions that we took. And so what we were looking for in support of the Urban League were investors who were concerned and interested in making America better for everyone. And so I went around selling us as a not-for-profit business that could provide consultative services to this America who needed to move forward in dealing with the plight of Black folks and Hispanics and Asians and poor people around this country. And that the Urban League was in a position to not only advise you on how you might do that, but we could even run demonstrations on what would be effective ways of programming to get there. And the other thing that I did, seeing them not as donors, but as investors, twice a year I would host my big-time donors to a reception at the New York Hilton, and I would stand before them and tell them what I did with their money. And one of the people who was at one of those meetings, I got a call from Evelyn Moore, who was running the Black Child Development Institute. And she said, there's a man that I've been working with who would like to have lunch with you. Would you be willing to have lunch with him? And I said, yeah, but he didn't need to go through you. All he had to do was call me. I'd be more than willing to have lunch with him. So he came over, we went to lunch, and he gave me $35,000. I thanked him for it, but I started including him in my meetings when I would talk about what we were doing. So one day he called up, he said, can we have dinner? I said, sure. So he takes me to dinner, and he said, UPS would like to be the first company to give you $1 million unsolicited.
Okay.
I never asked them for it. But I put someone from UPS on our board after he did that. A year or so later, the guy who came on the board from UPS, a guy named Cal Tyler, Cal said, can I see you for a minute? And I said, sure. He said, our foundation met yesterday, and we've decided that we want to give you another $1 million unsolicited. The lesson, as I tell not-for-profits all the time, if you have programs and services and knowledge that you can market to a broader public. You can convince them that it is good business to invest in what you're trying to do. That's how I tried to position the Urban League.
I'm sitting here in awe because that is precisely what it is that I do while I'm here at the Urban League. It's making sure that they understand the value proposition and the return for the support that they provide us through the programs and services. So it's all about the effectiveness and the metrics that are driving the outcomes. So I love that you were launching that for me to continue that.
Well, one of the things that I learned during my years in the Urban League is that David Kearns became
Chair.
My president after Coy Eklund retired. And David was doing business in South Africa. And I was trying to make the case that American businesses should leave South Africa. And so it was at the time that organizations and individuals were demonstrating at the South African Embassy. And the Urban League, by history, didn't engage in those kinds of activities. Well, local execs got upset with me. I was having a meeting with local execs, and they were upset because I had not gone to the South African Embassy to get arrested. And I said, well, why haven't you gone? They said, well, I have a board. I said, but I have a board. I said, but if we want to do this, let's do it all together. Let's go demonstrate at the South African Embassy. You talk to your board, I'll talk to my board, and we'll get this thing done. But let's do it right. I said, it turns out that the National Urban League Conference is in New York this year. Let's put it together and let's do a massive demonstration at the South African Embassy. Now, I got to go tell David Kearns that I'm going to take a demonstration to the South African Embassy, and he's doing business in South Africa. So I called him up and asked for an appointment. I went over to see him. And I began by saying, David, you got to come and go to jail with me. He said, Jake, I can't go to jail. I said, David, that's a joke. I don't want you in jail. I need you to get me out when I go. Yes. But he said something, Dennis, that I think every board member, particularly every corporate board member who sits on the Urban League board, should understand and appreciate. David said to me, Jake, I can support your position so long as you don't call me immoral or my company immoral. He said, I can support your position because your constituency is different from my constituency. And you got to do what's best for your constituency. Yes. And what I've always tried to get National Urban League board members to appreciate is that the Urban League's constituency is different from their constituency. And the Urban League has to do what's best for their constituency.
This is something we face today because, as we all know, we have somewhat of an adversarial government or a government contrary to a lot of the work that we're doing. And it's impacting our communities in such a huge way. And so it became a conversation that we needed to address. On one side, it was meeting our partners where they needed to be met. And we also understood they were trying to figure it out in this space. As much as we were kind of working through the issues and trying to meet them where they were, they didn't know how to show up. And so it became very confusing. So for us, there's a similarity in the times that we both were facing, which I find interesting. So I'm going to transition for a minute. You shared a little story earlier about what it means to be in this building. And I'd love for you to share that.
Yes, this is the culmination of a dream and a plan that the Urban League had way back in 1965. And what happened was, when Dr. King was assassinated April 1968, Washington blew up and they burned the town down. Sterling Tucker, who was then the head of the Washington Urban League, decided that the best role the Urban League could play was to set up rumor control centers, because what fuel riots are rumors. And our job then was to factor out what was fiction and what was real. And I was running one of the rumor control centers. And what we saw was very revealing in what took place. So after the riots, and after the city had calmed down a bit, Sterling Tucker pulled together a small group of his board members and a small group of his senior staff to discuss what are the lessons learned for the Urban League coming out of that riot. And most of the folks were saying that poor people burned the town down. And I finally said, poor people didn't burn this town down. It is true that I said poor people went shopping, because you got to remember Dr. King was killed during the Easter season. So they saw an opportunity to exploit that season. But if you were on the streets at night and you saw the people who were actually burning this town down, it was young college-looking kids. And those young people were the same ones who had sat in those civics classes when instructors were telling them that America was the land of opportunity, that America was a place of freedom, justice, and equality. America was all of these things for all of her people. And they knew that that wasn't true. So these young people decided to just teach America a lesson. And I said, the lesson for the Urban League movement is that we have to bring our processes in line with their impatience. And Sterling Tucker said, bring our processes in line with their impatience. He said, that sounds like a new thrust. Sterling Tucker could, out of that statement, factor a program that was implementable by the Urban League. And so we put together this thing called the New Thrust. And Sterling sold it to Whitney under one condition. Whitney said, I'll accept it if you will take a leave of absence from the Washington Urban League and come run the New Thrust program as a National Urban League staffer. And he did. I became the acting executive of the Washington Urban League at that time. But what happened growing out of that is that the New Thrust had two fundamental principles. One, we were going to show up our community organization skills. And two, local urban leagues, if they were not already located in communities where their constituency was, they needed to put offices in those communities where their constituency should be. This building, this development, in my opinion, is the living out of that dream of taking the Urban League and putting it in the community where the constituency that it represents and serves lives. That's why we are here, and it is the fulfillment of a dream that took place in 1968.
I love that. I love that. So when we were envisioning this building, a lot of folks, we had board members at the time who said, we're not investing in buildings. It's not, we don't do real estate. We're not, you can rent a space, renovate it, and it would be just fine. And they didn't understand what you just said.
Well, see, you got to understand Black people to understand that. For Black people to be property owners is fundamental. You got to remember, we never got the 40 acres and the mules.
Right.
And so Black folks have lived out the need to own, to have a stake in the ground, and something that represented value to them and to the world. So this is real. And it makes a statement of the wholeness
Yes.
of the organization.
It does. It does.
I mean, it speaks to a community that is saying, we own this. You know, one of the reasons why black churches are so important is that it is wholly owned by black folks.
Right.
One of the reasons why this is important is that it is black owned, and it makes a statement about black ownership by black people operating and operated by black people.
Yeah, no, I love that. See, for me, you know, as Mark and I were talking about this, we were talking about stable institutions, stable black institutions. And you looked around and you saw so many that were either being acquired, purchased, they were dying, but we're stable, 115 years solid. And being present in the community for us is that constant connection to our value proposition. When you support the Urban League, when you connect to the Urban League, all right, we're right here with you.
Absolutely. In fact, every Urban League that I have run, we either owned the property or I bought it when I got there. Because I thought it was important for black folks to demonstrate ownership.
Yeah. Well, I feel like there's a ton of subjects that I feel like actually what I'm going to do is I'm going to invite you back for another episode. That is what I'm going to do, because I think that there are segments to what I heard you just provide all of us that I think we should delve more into.
Okay.
Because I also want to connect the dot to how Urban League leaders across this country can hear more from you. And I think that's important, especially understanding investor, value proposition, and it's just more important than ever right now. We have a ton of CEOs that are, here less than 5 years, and they need guidance and they need to connect to yesterday. My father used to always say, you don't know where you're going if you don't know where you've been.
That's correct.
All right.
And the Urban League back in the 60s, we ran our own executive development program because schools were not producing the kind of quality executives that we needed and we wanted. And so we ran our own program and trained them.
That's beautiful.
Yeah.
John Jacob, thank you so much for your time, your leadership, just really the way you just taught us in this moment.
Thank you for having me.
So I appreciate that.
Thank you.
So thank you.
Thank you so much.
I hope you all enjoyed this dialogue as much as I did. Our leader, John Jacob, gave us tons of advice, counsel, and thought leadership, so much so that we're going to invite him back for another episode. I feel like we just touched the iceberg. I hope you enjoyed it as much as I did yet again. Thank you.